Hello, everybody. Welcome to the webinar, The Role of the LULUCF Sector and Emission Removal Technologies in Reaching Carbon Neutrality in 2015. My name is Kaidi Tam. I'm the Senior Expert in SEI Tallinn, and it's my pleasure to moderate this session. This webinar is part of the International Climate Reckon 2050 project, co-hosted by Ecologic Institute in Germany and supported by the European Climate Initiative. Climate Reckon is a platform for EU dialogue on national long-term strategies, and it aims to provide a forum for exchange of experiences and best practices, which is what we are doing also today. So a few words about our agenda. Please change the slide. So it's good if you change the slide, please. First, we hear from SEI Tallinn Climate and Energy Program experts Brigitta Toll and Peter Robert Walk, and they will introduce us the brand new report called Carbon Dioxide Removal Options in the National Long-Term Strategies of EU Member States. And this report will be published on Thursday. Next, and this report describes the current situation, highlights the key challenges and also shortcomings of the long-term strategies, and proposes improvement options. So this report does not aim to say everything about the LULUCF sector and also the emerging technologies in the EU in general, but it focuses on what is in the long-term strategies. And if you have any questions, you're welcome to use the question and answer function. And if you have any related or other comments, you can also post them in chat, but it's quite possible that we will not be able to look at the other comments. However, we try to answer all the questions, and you can also upvote the already posted questions if you give a thumbs up. And after the presentation by Brigitta and Robert, we will have 10 minutes for questions and answers. And after that, we will hear from 3 panelists. We have panelists from Italy, from Estonia, and from Germany. They come from different sectors and bring in different perspectives. And I will introduce the panelists on the go when we reach this point. But they are Dr. Hannes Böttcher from Germany, Kadi Ristkok from Estonia, and Dr. Marina Vitullo from Italy. And after the discussion among the panelists, we will also have the chance to ask questions from the panelists. So you can also, again, use the question and answer function to add your questions. And we will take as many questions as possible. And also here you can upvote the questions. And after that, we will have about 15 minutes for general discussion on the subject. So this is the agenda for today. We also have ground rules. So the ground rules are basically that for questions to the panel, please use the question and answer function. And also, if you have questions for regarding the report that is presented first, please also use this function. And please first add your name and then the question. And here again, the reminder that you can upvote the questions if you find them relevant, so they are more likely to get answered. Secondly, please use the chat for any other comments. However, if you use the chat instead of question and answers function, then this might be that we will not be able to pick these comments up during the session today. And last, this discussion, this round today will be recorded, and it will be made available online under climatedialogue.eu afterwards. And this is also the address where the report, which we will be presenting today, will be published on Thursday. So without further ado, I would like to give the word to Peter and Brigitta for presenting the report.
So where did the presentation go? Is it not being shared anymore?
Apologies, just a second.
Okay, okay. Yes, can we go to the next slide, please? So just to give a very brief introduction of this topic, we know from the IPCC that to have a reasonable chance of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees, climate neutrality needs to be reached by around 2050. And this is associated with an approximate carbon budget of 500 gigatons of CO2 equivalent. And once this is expended, all emissions must be counteracted, or at least counteracted by removals. And there are two real forms of removals that we can talk about: natural removals, which is essentially the LULUCF sector, and technological removals, of which we kind of consider only two in this report: bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, and direct air capture. We can also talk about kind of avoided emissions, where carbon is captured from a point source, a fossil fuel factory, for instance. And this is carbon capture and storage, or carbon capture and utilization, which is a very similar technique to BECCS. Our analysis was to try and assess how these issues are included in the decarbonization plans of the member states. And as stated, we did this by looking at the long-term strategies of each country, because this is really the plan that sets the guidelines for how they are aiming to achieve decarbonisation up to 2050. Can we go to the next slide, please? So just to talk about the LULUCF sector in a bit more detail, because this is at the moment kind of the only substantial form of net negative emissions. We see that although the EU has had a reduction in emissions over the last 30 years, the LULUCF sector has itself also been decreasing, or the size of the sink has been decreasing, especially since 2009. It manages at the moment to remove about 10% of the EU's emissions. We also see that the total emissions track quite well the forest removals, and harvested wood products notwithstanding, all of the net of the other sectors in the LULUCF sector are emitters. The EU also has certain targets for this sector. So, for instance, by 2030, just over 300 megatons should be removed. The EU modelling for climate neutrality has removals of around 400 megatons. And we also know that a combined land sector of agriculture and LULUCF should be climate neutral by 2035. However, the projections that we have for this sink indicate that it is likely to be smaller than these targets based on current plans. So the EU reference scenarios for the LULUCF sector in 2020 indicated removals of 271 megatons of CO2 in this year. Can we go to the next slide, please? So as stated, our report seeks to understand how these issues of removals are included in the long-term strategies of the member states, and particularly with the LULUCF sector to have a little bit of a look at how this intersects with other important issues such as the bioeconomy, agriculture and climate adaptation, and then to draw out comparisons and critical issues from across the member states to have an overarching picture of how natural and technological removals are included in the plans for the EU moving forwards. Can we go to the next slide, please? So we have, we had a standardized methodology to do this, looking at 7 different aspects. For brevity, I won't go into any more detail on this slide, but I refer you to the report to read about this in more detail. Can we go to the next slide, please? The first thing that we tried to do is to make our analysis a slightly more quantitative, and to try to understand what sort of sink requirements each country would need in order to reach climate neutrality. And we did this in a extremely simple way. We simply took the values that the country was stating, if it did that, for what the sink should be. If this was not given, which was the case for most countries, then we looked at what the country might have said in terms of what emissions reduction was expected excluding LULUCF, and then we could take the remainder as the necessary sink. In some cases, especially for old long-term strategies, climate neutrality might not be the target, and then the outstanding emissions were simply added on. For many countries, unfortunately, there was no overall target, and then we simply used a value of 85% of 1990 levels as the reduction, and that defines 15% as the necessary sink size. We could then compare these values to the EU reference scenarios for 2020 to see how close they are for each country. And we understand that this is a very simple analysis with many uncertainties and shortfalls, but it allows us to kind of paint a uniform picture for every country and to have kind of a baseline analysis of how close or how far away each country might be in terms of achieving the necessary sink size for climate neutrality. Can we go to the next slide, please? So I have listed here the reductions that we used for every country, and whether this was based on modeling or an assumption or a target. And we can see that for a lot of countries, we actually had to use an assumption, which means that we couldn't find a really clear reduction target or LULUCF sink size target for that country. Can we go to the next slide, please? So then we could compare these, as I said, to the EU reference scenarios for the LULUCF sink and see how close these two values are. And this is what this graph shows. So for each country, we have two bars. The bar in blue is the projected LULUCF sink in 2050. And the bar in orange is what we have determined as what the sink requirement for that country would be to reach climate neutrality. And we can see with the countries on the left that the projected sink sizes for some countries are in fact larger than what is needed for climate neutrality in our assessment, or they're rather similar. And then as we go more to the right, there are greater and greater differences between these two values. And indeed, for certain countries, we see that the projected LULUCF sink is going to be positive or very close to zero in 2050. Can we go to the next slide? As I stated, this is a very simple analysis, and I give an example here of the Baltic states of how we could improve it. So for instance, we know that between 1990 and 2005, the Baltic states had very large reductions in emissions. So a value of an 85% reduction, if that is what was used for 1990, is perhaps a little bit unfair on these countries. If instead we used a value of 85% reduction for emissions excluding the LULUCF sector on 2005 values. Can we go to the next slide, please? Then we get slightly different values. So the graph on the right shows our original assessment in red of what the sink size might be, and then our improved assessment in blue. And then the grey bar is still the EU reference scenarios. So you can see even with slightly improved analysis, based on this very simple analysis, only Lithuania is likely to have a sink size of the necessary magnitude. And the reason for this can be seen in the grey bars, that the EU reference scenarios project that for both Estonia and Latvia, the LULUCF sector is likely to be a net emitter or close to zero in 2050. Can we go to the next slide, please? So having done this, we can kind of group the countries into three. So the group of Sweden, Finland, and Spain are countries that we have called on track for climate neutrality. And this means that the sink sizes that we determined to be required are smaller than what is necessary, or smaller than what is necessary for climate neutrality. In fact, Spain state in their LTS that they need to use technological solutions. So that's why Sweden and Finland are in red, because they state that that is not necessarily the case. The countries in the middle we've described as within reach because they are countries where the ratio between the two values are less than a factor of 2. And the countries on the right are countries where the minimum sink requirements are a factor of 2 greater than what the sink is projected to be in 2050. And we can see that this unfortunately includes quite a lot of the countries in the EU. Can we go to the next slide? So based on this very simple sink analysis, we have some preliminary conclusions, which is that countries vastly differ in sink emission sizes or net emission sizes. For example, Sweden, Spain, and Italy have LULUCF sectors that are currently net sinks and are likely to remain net sinks until 2050. Whereas countries such as Denmark, the Netherlands, and the Republic of Ireland are projected to have net emissions in their LULUCF sector up to 2050. And this has consistently been seen since 1990. And these countries will consequently have greater difficulty in reaching climate neutrality because they don't have this large, or they're not projected to have this large LULUCF sink to fall back on. Out of the countries that do have projected net sinks, we found that only 3 are likely to have a sink of the necessary magnitude for climate neutrality under current plans based on our analysis. And we also see, looking particularly at the EU reference scenarios, that there are trends of significant change between countries. So for example, going back to the Baltic states, we know that Estonia and Latvia had previously had rather large sink sizes, but more recently their LULUCF sectors have become net sources. And according to these reference scenarios, at least, these sinks are not projected to fully recover until 2050. So this is also an issue that is potentially complicating or making more difficult the achieving climate neutrality than in a country such as Sweden, where the sink size is projected to remain relatively large. So I think I pass over to Brigitte now to continue the presentation.
Yes, we can switch to the next slide. So this is the more qualitative part of the analysis. We analyzed how the countries included the LULUCF sector in their long-term strategies, and it was found that 14 countries have it as a separate section, whereas 6 integrated it with agriculture and 2 did not include it as a separate section at all. However, there were some references to the sector still throughout the document. Some of the most common aspects were found land planning. Several countries had goals for net zero land conversions by 2050. Afforestation and reforestation were some of the measures that were mentioned the most often. Whereas it's interesting that for the Netherlands, for example, they kind of included it from the point of view that afforestation will be done in other countries and collaboration could be used there because of the land restrictions of the country itself. And also monitoring was included by 5 countries. But overall, the length and detail of the LULUCF sections in the strategies had great variation. And we can switch the slide. So for forestry, we know that forests make up the biggest or even the only part of the sinks. And as mentioned, afforestation and reforestation were mentioned the most in most strategies. However, a few provided also quantitative targets for forest cover. And some small countries highlighted the difficulties in increasing this due to the space constraints. Forest management practices, the age structure and the quality of the forests may be even of greater importance than forest cover in some cases. For example, in Estonia, our country is covered by forest by more than 50%, but the LULUCF sector has recently become an emitting one. And the really important issue of sink stability was hardly included at all by the countries. 2 exceptions that are found here are Austria and France. And most countries, or nearly all countries, improved or included the improved forest management or mentioned the sustainable forestry in some way, but this often lacked in details, so it was kind of difficult to understand what it meant if it was not engaged upon. And 5 countries mentioned reductions in burned areas. These were mostly countries that faced these issues, like Spain, Portugal, Italy, Croatia. And many countries called for development of mixed forests of native species, which would help with climate adaptation because these species are more resilient to climate change. You can go to the next slide. So besides forests, wetlands and peatlands were included the most. And for wetlands, it was universal to halt degradation or enhance the restoration, or in some other ways limit the peat extraction. There was also some discussion about permanent grasslands and croplands, but this was done to a lesser extent. And there it was emphasized that the size or the carbon content of the permanent grasslands has to be increased, and rarely some quantitative data was also included. And croplands, settlements, and other lands were not discussed much at all. And on the right, we can see like a little takeout of the report of how we did this. So you can see what kind of land categories were mentioned by which countries and what kind of details they gave on this, like measures, description, targets, and so on. We can go on. So as the LULUCF sector also has quite a lot of intersections with agriculture, biodiversity, and adaptations, then we quickly take a look at this as well. So for adaptation, Spain had the most comprehensive strategy because they also described the interactions between adaptation and mitigation. And also Portugal, Slovakia, Slovenia, and Sweden had adaptation described quite well for agriculture. Luxembourg, Slovakia, and Slovenia had the best strategies, and also several countries mentioned agroforestry as a measure. For biodiversity, definitely Slovenia and Belgium had the best strategies. And in terms of having an equal focus on the topics, I would say that Belgium and Croatia were good examples in this because their strategies were really comprehensive and they put equal focus on these topics and also the overlaps between them. For example, Belgium had a separate section about adaptation in the agricultural sector. However, Austria mentioned that there is competition between the 3 sectors of biodiversity mitigation and bioresources, and that the balance must be found between them. Can go on. Most countries, almost all, mentioned that they plan to increase the use of bioresources, some to a bigger extent than others. Some did not give information on this, like the Netherlands, Malta, and Hungary, or didn't give like a clear indication, but we could presume from the strategies that this is planned. And Finland and Denmark foresaw a modest increase or a stagnation until 2050. It was mentioned that most countries want to develop the bioeconomy sustainably and not compromise other goals like food sufficiency, biodiversity, and others. Yeah, but there were no real details on how this was achieved. And developing bioeconomy often results in greater land use. So that is one potential conflict. And we can go on. A lot of countries mentioned the hierarchy of sustainability because they saw that increasing the share of wood and long-lived products was a good alternative to carbon-intensive products. And there were some countries who put more focus on energy use and mainly discussed this. For example, Greece did this heavily. Also, the use of biomass in district heating systems was predicted to increase in the Croatian and Hungarian strategies, while the consumption in households should decrease. The negative effects of biomass combustion were discussed by 3 countries, Lithuania, Portugal, and Slovakia. Also, in the future, bioenergy from cultivated crops will decrease and waste will gain more importance, according to these countries. And in the transport sector, the main potential is seen in aviation and shipping for bioresources and biofuels. Can go on. However, at sometimes there were like potential conflicts in the strategies for bioresources and natural sinks. And I've given 2 examples here where this was kind of clearly mentioned. However, I'm sure there could be more. So Denmark plans to increase the share of forests and bioenergy-based electricity production, but there were no details on the source of this bioenergy, so it could be a potential conflict. And for Italy, really like strong wording was used. They said that they plan to fully exploit the potential of biomass, so more information could be given on this. And they also emphasized the importance of sustainable forest management. And we can go on. So Peter, back to you.
Yes, back to me. So we also considered how CCS and CCU were included in the long-term strategies. And this analysis is also rather more qualitative, I would say. So we found that the degree to which this was included in the different countries varied greatly, as many things do in the long-term strategies. And the picture you can see, the map shows our assessment of how positively countries viewed these technologies. So we found that the countries in green in this map viewed CCS and CCU rather positively, or plan to exploit it if possible. The countries in brown were more ambivalent to it. They perhaps didn't mention it in much detail, or didn't mention it, mention it in such positive terms. And the countries in red are the ones that we assess to see it rather more negatively, and say that they wouldn't really use these technologies. And we can see that there are more countries in green than there are in red. So more countries, according to our assessment of the long-term strategies, are planning to use these technologies than not. We found that there were certain countries, Hungary comes to mind, that planned to use the CCS and found it important for their climate neutral modelling. And in terms of where this was targeted, it was most often found in industry and for instance, cement and then steel. But a key sort of thing that we have to bring up is that it was not very easy to make a distinction between CCS and BECCS in terms of which, in many cases, a country was talking about. And this made it difficult to kind of this was, for instance, the reason why CCS, CCU were included in our analysis in the first place, because we couldn't be sure whether the country was talking about BECCS or CCS, CCU. Can we go to the next slide, please? So we also here highlight in a bit more detail what countries were saying, or give some examples of some countries. So Hungary views CCS, CCU rather positively, states that it wants to use it in the energy and industry sectors, and in fact even has values for how much CO2 should be removed or not emitted, let's say, based on these technologies. They particularly also talked about utilization of the captured carbon for fuels, and this is because of limited storage capacity. Country that sits on the other side of the of the argument would be Portugal, and they stated that they only thought that these technologies could be useful for the cement sector, but the sector kind of is too small in Portugal for the impact to really be useful, and the utilization for fuel in their opinion would not be cost effective. A final example is France, who stated that they would use it for industry, and again gave a figure, and would use it as soon as conditions allow. And they placed more emphasis on storage rather than use. Can we go to the next slide, please? And of course, we also wanted to look at kind of true removal, so BECCS and DAC, and we found that these were referenced in less detail and less often than CCS CCU. Most of what was included was descriptive, but of course some of that could be because what was called CCS was actually BECCS. And we found that DAC, which we kind of use as a proxy for all of the kind of more emerging removals of diffuse carbon from the atmosphere, was very rarely mentioned. Only the Netherlands and Hungary kind of talked about this in some details. Maybe there was a couple more, but it was very rarely mentioned. Again, we can look at the kind of the country description. So Portugal, again, similarly to CCS, CCU, think that these are not cost effective based on current technologies, but it is a EU research priority area. Finland actually had two modeling scenarios that reached climate neutrality, and one of these used BECCS to quite a high degree, but the other scenario didn't require it. And again, France state that BECCS will be used to quite a high degree and requires a centralized source of biomass. They also state that the technology is uncertain.
Just to comment that we need to wrap up the presentation because we also have a couple of questions.
Okay. Let's move to the next slide. I think I'm yes, I will just say that these are our conclusions based on technologies, and these can be read in more detail in the report once it's published.
Yes, I don't think we can skip these, as these are the main recommendations. Maybe we can go back to these. Yes, here. So while updating the strategies, the country should definitely specify the total reductions and the targeted sink size. Also, sink stability should be included by all countries in the future, because this is a critical issue. Better integration with biodiversity is necessary, because this has as great as an impact as the climate crisis. Countries have to elaborate more on their proposed measures, because currently it's not so clear about how they propose to achieve the goals they have set. Also, more focus should be put on other land use categories besides forests, as right now forests are pretty much the only sinks on the EU level besides harvested wood products. And agriculture and LULUCF should be combined in the future rather than viewed separately, because they have great overlaps and interaction, and this is also being done in the EU level in the future, as well as adaptation and the use of bioresources has to be looked at with a greater, more diverse view than just a tunnel vision. We can go on. And better distinction must be made between the technologies, because right now it was sometimes unclear what kind of technologies the countries were planning to use. For example, Sweden uses the phrase negative emission technologies, but France is one good example where clear distinctions between the technologies are made. Emphasis should be definitely put on more ambitious mitigation and enhancement of sinks. However, countries could make use of collaboration. For example, Sweden has enough resources to meet the requirements of Malta as well. And the only country who has currently mentioned this in their strategy already was the Netherlands. And collaboration also in other activities. For example, Hungary and Luxembourg want to develop a map of ecosystem services and forest biotypes, and good practices could be shared, because in Estonia this has also been developed. So thank you. This is all from our side.
Thank you very much, Brigitta and Peter. We have three questions. I'll take the highest ranked first. This comes from Finland, from Tuomo Kalliokoski, and he asks Peter, did you compare the initial sink value in LTC scenario and current situation in the country? My understanding is that in some countries they still differ quite much. If so, what is the impact of it on your analysis?
Yeah, so thank you for the question. I'm not sure I completely understand, but basically, yes, we did look at what the current sink was and compare this to what the EU reference scenario was in I think 2030, 2040 and 2050. And we did find that for some countries they were stable. Sweden is a good example of this. And for other countries, the sink was projected to increase or decrease. I don't remember off the top of my head a good example in either case. I think Germany perhaps was projected to have a large increase in the sink according to the EU reference scenarios.
Thank you. Next, we have a question by Andreas Graf, and he asks, what makes the EU reference scenario a good benchmark for BAU? Is there a reason you chose this metric over member state projections?
I guess I would answer that question by saying the EU reference scenarios probably are not a good option, but they're the best one that we have, in that they were the only thing that we could find that provided a universal or uniform kind of description for every country. And as our kind of analysis was meant to get the conversation started, let's say, we felt it was more important to provide an overview for each country, to give a benchmark figure for each country, than to look at more specific projections, which would maybe have distracted from the other analysis that's in our report. I guess that's what I would say, that of course, in reality, the values might be different. And we just wanted to then give a first value of what kind of sink size might be necessary, and what size of sink might be likely in 2050, and see how close or far apart these two values were.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And then we have the last question from Edgard Karafeld, and he asks, forest is short-time sink for only up to 100 years. Why peatlands are underestimated, although they accumulate carbon as peat for thousands of years, and in Europe they contain approximately 5 times more carbon than forests.
Yeah, if we can just move a few slides, 3 slides maybe, then I added this there. Okay, maybe 4. A bit more. It should come after, like the.
I think we're moving in the wrong direction, actually.
Well, anyway, we also included this in our report. Yeah, in the wrong direction. Yes, this one. We also included this in our report, and we totally agree with this. As we said, like, more focus should be put on other land use categories as well, besides forests. So yes.
Mm-hmm. And the last, we have one more question, and then we will move on to our panel. So we have a question from Andrzej Kassenberg, and he asks, the war in Ukraine and the energy crisis have made wood an important fuel for heat production. Do you think this will affect the outcome of your analysis?
Well, most of the long-term strategies were submitted before the war. So this isn't kind of reflected in this, but it has an impact, definitely, yes. A very great impact.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you very much, Brigitta and Peter. And we'll go on with the 3 panelists from Italy, Estonia, and Germany, who represent different sectors and different perspectives. So first, we will hear from Dr. Hannes Böttcher. He is a senior researcher and team lead of the group Biogenic Resources and Land Use, at the Eco Institute in Berlin, Germany. And first, each panelist has about 5 to 7 minutes where they can express their views, and then we will go on with discussion. So the floor is yours, Hannes.
Yeah, good morning, everybody. Thank you, Kaidi. Also, thank you for inviting me to this panel. I would like to start my reflection with a short career of the LULUCF in history. And if we think back on LULUCF in the Kyoto times, when first forests were introduced into the climate framework, it was first important to include LULUCF and forests to get countries on board. So obviously already there, the sink mattered for many countries like Russia to be really then engaging in the protocol. But on the other hand, also the LULUCF was exaggerated in the sense that it was very good to have a large sink reported because only a fraction of that could be accounted for. So in those days, there were large sinks reported, and it was good to have large sinks in the inventories. Then there came Kyoto 2 and the LULUCF decision, and we introduced the forest management reference levels, highly complex in structure and in developing those. And in those times, it was better to have a rather low projected sink in LULUCF, especially in forests, because we had this comparison against the reference level. And of course, then countries wanted to be better than that. And so it was good to have a low projected forest sink. So now we're entering a new phase with a LULUCF regulation, especially the revised one that's moving reporting much closer to accounting and trying to avoid any projections. So the reference level in forest is now based on historic intensities observed. And so this is of course helping to bring these two together. But of course, if we now look at the sink targets that can be achieved in countries, I think countries now realize with a closer look at the inventories also and the development in the trend that the LULUCF sector is much harder to steer than we thought. There's demand for products from the sector that's counteracting the sink development. It's much more economic interest increasing also with, of course, the war situation. Land competition is increasing. Plus, we have long lead times introducing measures in the sector. So it's much more complex to steer the sector than we thought. So when we're then thinking about what is the demand for things in the future, and you introduced this concept of minimum sink requirement, of course it's simple, but it's of course difficult if LULUCF is the residual, because if it's difficult to steer, then it shouldn't be the residual. Then it should be really an integral part of mitigation planning. And you mentioned this in the report that very few countries are actually looking at a combined sector projection where LULUCF is included. So for producing such kind of more integrated scenarios and projections for LULUCF, I see 4 major challenges. Looking at the current methodologies that are applied. And the first is inconsistency of methodologies. So I guess member states will really have a hard time using the tools they have for projections for reproducing the historic inventories. So there's a gap between the methodology that is used for reporting, which is then used in the end for achieving the target and documenting that the target is achieved, and the projections. So often these don't match well because different methodologies are used. And this is of course also difficult if you have measures included in the long-term strategy that are then not reflected in the inventories. So you have a projection that's distinct from the inventories that are actually then needed to document that the target is achieved. This mismatch has to be overcome, and those methodologies have to be much much more compatible and consistent. Second point is incomplete processes. So climate change impacts are hardly included in these projections, especially on forests. There's also the question, shouldn't those projections include more the demand side? So really reflect that there might be increasing trends of demand on wood, trade effects, especially climate change impacts are also important because we need to assess the long-term strategies in terms of, are they also the right strategies for adaptation? And you mentioned that only a few countries are actually thinking together mitigation and adaptation. The third point is lack of diversity, I would call it, in both models and scenarios. I think there's a need to employ different models running with the same assumptions to gain insights on uncertainties and sensitivities of these scenarios instead of these single line trajectories. So I'm thinking of these ensemble modeling like we know from climate modeling for the IPCC report. So you don't have a single line, but a corridor of likely developments. Of course, this also requires a different strategy for communicating these scenarios, because it's not a single line. It's much more complex, but I think it's more robust results delivered from those corridors. And the fourth point is, from my view, lack of participation. So I think if there's more stakeholder involvement and stakeholder input taken up for developing long-term strategies and those scenarios, there's also more room for scientific and societal scrutiny of the process, but also of the projections themselves. In the end, also helping to make them more robust in terms of, have we thought of all the eventualities that could be included? And I close here at this point. Thank you.
Thank you, Hannes, for this systematic approach and overview. So we will, if you have questions regarding what Hannes shared, then please use the Q&A function. And now we will go on directly with Kadi Ristkok, who is the head of climate at the Estonian Ministry of Environment. So the floor is yours, Kadi, please.
Thank you, Kaidi. So from the climate policy point of view, the LULUCF sector is clearly vital for reaching climate neutrality. I think from everyone's point of view, it should be. And that's true from a national, but also EU and global level point of view. And it is the only sector that has the natural ability to bind carbon from the atmosphere. So every plan that we have to get to net zero needs to take LULUCF very seriously, of course. And as outlined also in your report, Estonia has recently seen decreases in our sink size, and the LULUCF sector has become a source of net emissions. In 2020, our total carbon emissions were 12.8 million tons of CO2 equivalent, out of which 1.3 million tons came from the LULUCF sector. Now, to reverse this trend, we are currently looking for suitable measures. This is much more detailed than what we would see in the long-term strategy, of course. But the difficulty with the LULUCF sector is the time frame, as was earlier mentioned as well. We can't only look at the short-term solutions, because we need to the sector to bind carbon also in 30, 50, and 100 years. And of course, as was also mentioned, it takes time for trees to grow, right? So in the next 10 years, we need to see a big change in the emissions of our economies. And by 2030, the EU needs to reduce its net emissions by 55% compared to 1990, which means not only fast changes in the energy sector, but also in transport, agriculture, and others. These changes are vital for us to achieve climate neutrality. And we also need to keep in mind that LULUCF cannot take up all the carbon in the carbon-intensive economy. It has its limits, and every sector needs to take their part in the climate ambitions. But regardless of the measures that we take in these sectors, there will always be emissions that are impossible to reduce to zero. So of course, that will take some time to reduce to this minimum, where LULUCF will then play the part to compensate what cannot be reduced. And our LTS, our long-term strategy, currently is yet to be updated with our climate neutrality goal. It was adopted for Estonia in the ASD 2035 strategy. That's like an umbrella strategy for all sectors. And the long-term strategy we have currently was composed in 2017, and doesn't take these recent developments into account. The long-term strategy, the way we use it is not a detailed description of all the measures needed to reach our 2030 and 2050 goals. It's rather a general view of the direction that should be taken in climate policy in order to receive to reach our climate goals in the coming decades. And it gives the direction to sectoral development plans that need to go then in more detail in how those targets can be reached. However, we do need to have a society-wide discussion about the contribution of the main sectors of our economy to the 2030, but also 2050 climate goals. And in this process, we also need to look at LULUCF very seriously, and the recommendations you have made in the report can definitely help us. But also regarding the different means to use technology to sequester carbon, and maybe also to the direction that we're seeing right now more and more is the contribution of private companies to increase the capacity of LULUCF to sequester more carbon, and I think the legislation is starting to be formed on that. Thinking about offsets, for example, this could definitely be a solution to help our LULUCF sector bind more. I think I will stop here now to leave some time for discussion. Thank you.
I think we lost the moderator, Gaidi, for a second. I hope she will figure this technical issue out. But for now, I think we can continue, and the floor is yours, Marina.
Thank you, Joanna, and thank you for inviting me in this panel. Really interesting presentation and discussion. And agree with what the previous panelist just said. Complexity is a key word when we talk about the LULUCF sector. Is a key when we talk about methodology to be used in the reporting, so the IPCC methodology, but it's also relevant when we talk about the different set of rules that have been fixed at the European level with the European regulation, but also in international context, like the Convention on Climate Change or the Paris Agreement. So to deal with this complexity is utmost important to try to focus in only let's say one agency or one national level, if we think to have this kind of arrangement, all the issues related to the reporting and also the planning of policies and measures. And this was what we did, for instance, in Italy, and we focus in only one agency these tasks, and so for us was quite easier to address the reporting and but also the planning of policies measure and the compilation of long-term strategies. And for instance, for our long-term strategies, we were able to assess a reference scenario considering all the sector. This means all categories, carbon pools and gases, including also methane and N2O from forest fires or from other kind of disturbances. And we started from a very, in my view, a very complicated complex task that was the assessment of land use and land use change for the whole period till 2050. And this is quite tricky because we consider several factors, including all the possible potential interlinkages with other sectors, mainly agriculture for food production and land use, but not only the agriculture sector. And for instance, we implied these, let's say, the need for food production in the category like cropland, but also we reflect the livestock assessment that was carried out in agriculture sector in the assessment of the use of grassland, for instance. And was really important for us to include in our reference scenario the impact of the IPCC climate change scenarios. So basically, we include the two scenarios of climate change that was suited for Italy, and we try to detect and to highlight the key elements from these scenarios to be included in our reference scenario. And for LULUCF, the key one was the impact of disturbances, in particular for fires, that was one of the key drivers in the result of the reference scenario that we had in Italy. The reference scenario has a declining trend of removals, of LULUCF removal, basically due to the increase of fire intensity and emission from land use conversion to cropland. And so to design a decarbonization scenario, we try to include some activities or some policies to be planned and adopted in order to reverse this situation, in order to at least align the removal in 2050 with the current and the historical trend of removal that we have in Italy. But to do this, we have to put in place some really strong measure in order to suppress and to prevent fires on forests, but not only in forests, also in grassland. There was quite effective in terms of emissions, and also to to try to adopt more environmentally friendly management practices in cropland, in grassland, in order to enhance the soil carbon stocks, especially in cropland and grassland. And this is really important since, as we already heard also from the previous speakers, that the LULUCF sector will be more and more relevant in the next future, since we have to abate the emission. We have to reduce emission from all the economic sectors, but there will be some emission that will be really difficult to reduce, like for instance emission from the agriculture sector. And so we need to have the LULUCF sector removals, trying to at least to compensate these emissions. For Italy, in our long-term strategy, we assess that this could be not the case in 2050, and we need to use also CCS or CCU in order to achieve the neutrality. And one of the key points for us is to address the consideration of climate change impacts in our design of scenario, because this is something that really affects a lot the result of emission and removals in the sector, and could also play a key role in the decarbonization. And I think that I could stop now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Marina Vitullo. I'm sorry I dropped out because of an internet issue, so I was not able to say thank you, Gadi Ristkok, for your perspectives, and just in retrospective to say that Dr. Martina Vitullo is a researcher at the Institute of Environmental Protection and Research in Italy. And she also is the national inventory compiler for LULUCF, as well as a compiler for Italian long-term strategy. So she spoke from her practical experience as well. So first, we have a couple of questions from the audience, but before I give, I will read the questions to you. Maybe the panelists would like to comment on what the others said first. So that would be very nice to hear your reflections. Hannes, Gadi, Marina, do you have something that you would like to comment on or share or add right now in a free forum before we go to questions? I see that Hannes has something to share. Please go ahead.
Yeah, maybe on the last point I mentioned on participation, it was interesting to hear from Gadi that you're planning to have this societal dialogue, and maybe a question to you. I would be interested in how you organize that and how you consider which groups are relevant for the process or should be considered, just out of interest how you organize such a dialogue, so to have really all voices heard in the process.
Yes, thank you, Hannes. Basically, what we see is that the new LULUCF target is going to be very hard to reach. So we're trying to take a very open approach to it, to first take a look at the possible changes in all of the LULUCF sectors, and also the effort sharing.
Gadi, I think we cannot hear you. Maybe you can say the sentence again. Can everybody else hear Gadi? No? Something happened with your voice. I'm afraid that we don't hear you anymore. Something changed.
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Oh, now we can hear you, yes.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, what I was saying briefly was that in the LULUCF sector, with the new goal, we see that it's going to be quite hard to reach this goal. So from the beginning, we want to adopt this very inclusive and open approach to it, to first take a look at the different measures and changes that can be done in the given time frame in the LULUCF sector. We're looking at the 2030 goal right now, of course, but as was mentioned, 2030 in LULUCF means also looking at the longer time frame. So we're trying to gather all the different options in all the sectors, and then to open the discussion for also looking at not only the carbon or the greenhouse gas side of things, but also the socio-economic impacts. As was also mentioned, we need to take into consideration the demand that we have for our forests and land use, and to really openly debate about how we want to use our land in the limits of that the planet and the nature gives us. But more concretely, I think we first need to come up with the different changes and measures that can be done in different sectors, and then what is going to proceed is going to be a public debate.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Katie, for this explanation of how you aim to tackle this major task. So we have about a bit over 15 minutes left. So maybe if Marina, Katie, and Hannes, if you have one more comment that you would like to share, you're welcome to do so. Otherwise, I would go on to questions, because we have also questions to you. So I'll go on to questions. Mm-hmm. The first question: given that the LULUCF sector is hard to steer, as Hannes Böttcher mentioned, and increasingly contested in the context of net zero targets, how plausible is it that we will see the proposed merger with agriculture into the FOLU sector in EU climate policy? One moment. And an additional question, if in your view, what are the main benefits and risks of this proposal? So this is mainly targeted to Hannes, I understand.
Yeah, thank you for the question. So when I said it's difficult to steer, I didn't mean that there shouldn't be ambitious targets for the sector. And of course, also the sector needs to bring this contribution. As you rightly said, it's currently the only sector that's providing negative emissions. I think what is needed is really a realistic assessment of what it costs. So both in terms of what is really the impacts on other services of the land, but also so this will likely then increase the costs of mitigation in the land use sector and providing these net negative emissions, but also including benefits from certain methods, from certain measures that would then lower the costs. But these are then cost reductions in other sectors provided through ecosystem services that these measures come along with, that are currently not valued. Yeah, so it's really an incomplete picture we have of really the impacts of measures in the sector, and this might lead to the conclusion: oh, we have low-hanging fruits, and we can do fast measures that have a strong impact. But I think to both sides, so both synergies and trade-offs are not fully included in the assessments, and it's really then targeting towards maybe not the adequate best and adequate measures. That's my answer to this. And regarding the AFOLU proposal, I think the danger with having a merger target is reduction of visibility. So it's fine to try to increase ambition level by saying, look, we have an additional target, which is a neutrality target for these two sectors. But what should not be done at the same time is to remove the net sink target for LULUCF, because I think we even need more targets also regarding the emissions in LULUCF. Yeah, it's LULUCF is a net result of emissions and removals, and I think increasing the net sink has also to mean that we are decreasing the emissions from the sector, and by just putting more emissions and mixing more processes, we are not increasing visibility. So I'm opting whatever other sectors are counted against and compared to, we still need these net targets, and even better, like the EU Parliament proposed, to have also a target for the emissions parts in the LULUCF.
Mm-hmm. Marina, please.
Yes, I agree with Agnes, but one of the additional risks to merge the LULUCF and agriculture sector in only one let's say, sector that should be neutral by 2035, as in the, let's say, latest regulation and proposal, is to put a lot of pressure on agriculture sector, because this will imply sooner or later that other sectors that are currently reported under the effort sharing regulation, so waste or transport, probably will be moved under ETS or other kind of framework, and so agriculture will be more or less responsible for all the missing removal by LULUCF and vice versa. And this is really risky, because we know that agriculture is fundamental for food production, food security, and LULUCF and agriculture cannot be blamed for decarbonization of the whole economic sector in our country. Thank you.
Thank you. So let's go on with questions. Brigitta, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I saw that this question was also to our part, and I just quickly wanted to kind of add on that I agree with the risks, but maybe the sector could be combined with agriculture later on in the future, because I understand that there will be additional pressure on agriculture. But when we did the analysis, it was kind of hard to draw the line between LULUCF and agriculture, because it has so many overlaps, and like the measures could go under both. So yeah, this was just like our way why we wanted to combine it.
Thanks for the clarification, Brigitta. So now a question to the broad circle of panelists and speakers from Poland. How do you think the implementation of the different climate change scenarios from the 1.5 degree to 4 or 5 degrees will affect the absorption capacity? According to a study in Poland, from 30 million tons of CO2 now, this could drop to less than 10 million tons of CO2 with a negative scenario. Who would like to comment on this? Please, Marina.
Yes, as I was mentioned in my previous intervention, in our long-term strategies, we introduced the effect of these IPCC climate change scenarios, and they really affected in a large way the total removal in 2050. We passed from around 40 millions of tons to something more, 20 millions of tons in 2050. Mainly because of fires. So the fires that will be affect more forests and grasslands. So this is really important, and I think that this is one of the points that probably European Union could also think to have a sort of integrated approach for all member states. So to deliver some national level climate change scenarios in order for highlighting the key elements to be taken into account for the different economic sectors. So starting from the production of energy from the different sources, for instance, but also for agriculture, from LULUCF, in order to have a more, let's say, harmonized strategies for all member states. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Does anybody want to add something here?
Yes, and on the Estonian side, we definitely also see a great impact of climate change to LULUCF sector and all the bioeconomic sectors. In fact, what we already see is troubles with bark beetles that come along with snowless and warmer winters, for example, and some other impacts like that. But what we're planning to do in the coming years is to update our own climate change scenarios and to see the concrete impacts that it's going to have. So we're going to have more updated data on that very soon. Thank you, Kadi. Hannes?
Yeah, maybe just to stress, I agree with Marina. Integrating those climate change impacts, of course, gives maybe more realistic results, but realistic means also then it's a much wider range we get. Yeah, so much more complexity. It's not only temperature effects and extreme events, but it's also water availability when we talk about mitigating through rewetting of organic soils. But I think it's important to include these effects in a sensitivity analysis to really be prepared that there is no easy way in a climate change world to mitigation in the land use sector, and to have better strategies also for adaptation in the end. So we might even have the need to first reduce the sink for example, transferring forests that are not well adapted into more adapted forests, which might mean that in the short term we are decreasing the sink, but have a longer term stabilization of the sink. So this all needs to be included, and then we find the right path. But it's, as I said, it's not a single path. It's a corridor path.
Yes. So we have a question which is for the first presentation, but which is actually also relevant for or can be well answered by our panelists. So the question is, did you reflect the changes of vegetation types when predicting the future carbon capture amount? I think some countries could experience the big changes in vegetation. And that's the first question. I don't know, Brigitta or Peter, do you want to comment on that?
We couldn't really include this because we based on the information that the countries provided in the long-term strategies. If they had it in the modeling, then yes. Otherwise, no, because it was all done based on the long-term strategies. But this is something that clearly has an influence and should be taken into account.
Mm-hmm. And one more very brief question. Did you consider methane emission for these calculations?
No, but if the agriculture and LULUCF sector would be combined, we could.
Mm-hmm. So there is one more question. Over the last couple of years, climate NGOs in Brussels have actively advocated against merging of agriculture and LULUCF into a land use sector. helping to bury the proposal of the European Commission to do so. Can you explain a bit more detail why they should reconsider?
I think I already answered that before when I commented.
Okay, good. So now we have only 5 minutes left. And I really would like to thank the panelists for being here. And it would actually be very interesting to have a longer conversation with you. So let's see, maybe we can organize something. And thank you also very much for Brigitta and Peter for the report that brought us together today. This report will be available in a couple of days. Maybe Diana, you can show the link. Yes, on the page of Climate Dialogue EU. And this will be published on Thursday. We will also see if there are any comments or pointers from this session that we might include in the final report. And I think that everybody who participated might also get this link in an email. So it will make it easier for you to find the report. Maybe one more last question to our panelists. You were able to review the conclusions and also the recommendations that this report made. So was there something that you would like to, based on your own experience, emphasize one more time so that everybody who listens would bear this in mind when we talk about these issues? What is the key message that you would like to highlight? And if this is not, it doesn't necessarily have to come from the report, it can also be based on your own experience. So maybe first of all, Hannes.
Yeah, maybe what would be interesting to know, it's difficult to assess, of course, how large are actually the units that are working on these strategies, because I sometimes have the impression that those groups are understaffed and that it's hasn't been a big topic in many member states. Now it turns out it's a key sector for climate neutrality, and I think there needs to be many more experts in the countries to work on this important topic. So if you could include maybe an indicator of how many people are working in this on the strategies, but also give an indication on which countries would have to invest into staff for better projections and more information.
Very relevant point. Actually, I think Marina and Kadi could answer, but we only have like 2 minutes left. So let's see if they want to comment on it. Please, Marina.
Yes, not on this point, but only if you could also add some information, if you have on it, on the different member states and the differences between what they reported for in their long-term strategies and their current reporting. Because I heard that actually you did this assessment, so it could be really nice to have this information also in a table or some other places. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Marina. And Kati, you have the word for the final final comment now.
Yes, first of all, thank you very much for this great report. It's very insightful. And maybe to come to Hannes's question, a very good question. I think there are different approaches also to what is kind of outsourced to researchers and what is centrally done in the government teams. But I would also be glad to see that information if you have that. On our side, it's kind of some of it is done in-house. We have a policy experts working on that. We have one coordinator, and then for each sector there are counterparties in different teams for the LULUCF. But then also we have a more technical kind of reporting and projections team working on that with I would say about 5 people, and then of course the outsourced research side that cannot be undermined, I would say. But yeah, very, very insightful, and thank you for the discussions to everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kadi, for this information. Estonia is a small country, so probably in Italy or Germany or in many other countries, the teams are much bigger. Also, the outsourcing has a different scale. So thank you again also from my side for this meeting. Thank you for the panelists, for the presenters, and of course also thank you very much to all of the people who came and listened and asked questions. And we will get back to you with a report and wish you a really nice afternoon. Bye-bye.